Genetically modified foods, they seem to be absolutely everywhere, don't they?
Oh, definitely. From the corn in your food to even the cotton in your shirt sometimes.
Right. And yet, for something so, well, embedded in our lives, they spark such intense debate. It makes you wonder how much people really know beyond maybe the headlines or strong opinions.
That's a great point. There's a lot of noise out there.
So today, that's exactly what we're doing. A proper deep dive, our mission, to cut through that noise. We want to unpack the science, look at the controversies, understand the global picture.
Yeah, get into the real substance of it.
Exactly. And we've got a stack of material here, research papers, reports from big organizations, global stats, the works.
A lot to draw from.
The whole idea is that you, listening, can walk away feeling genuinely well-informed with maybe a clearer perspective.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay, so to really get this, we need to start right at the beginning. What exactly are we talking about when we say genetically modified foods?
Okay. Well, essentially, GM foods, or GMOs, as most people call them, they come from organisms. That could be plants, animals, even tiny microorganisms.
Okay.
And their genetic material, their DNA, it's been altered, but not just randomly altered. It's done using specific genetic engineering techniques.
With a purpose.
Exactly, with a specific purpose. The goal is usually to give that organism some kind of new, desirable trait.
Like what kind of traits?
Oh, things like resistance to pests, maybe improved nutritional value, or perhaps even making it last longer on the shelf.
Got it. That makes sense as a starting point. So with the DAT definition clear, let's explore the case for GM foods because, there are some really interesting, maybe even surprising benefits claimed.
There certainly are, and a major one, often the first one mentioned, is increased crop yield.
Higher yields, how does that work?
Well, many GM crops are engineered to resist things that normally damage them, pests, diseases. So farmers can potentially get more harvest from the same amount of land, often using fewer inputs like pesticides.
Could you give an example?
Sure. A classic one is bite corn. It actually produces its own natural insecticide.
Inside the plant itself.
Yeah, it comes from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, or bite pea. And this helps kill off specific insect pests that would otherwise eat the corn.
And does the data back this up? The higher yield idea.
It does. There was a big analysis, Klumper and Queen back in 2014, published in PLOS One. They looked at studies globally and found, on average, GM crops increased yields by about 22%.
Wow, 22% average increase. That's pretty substantial.
It's significant, yeah.
And you mentioned pests. So does that pest resistance directly mean less spraying of chemical pesticides?
In many cases, yes. If the crop can defend itself better against certain insects or diseases, farmers just don't need to apply as much chemical treatment.
Makes sense.
We see this with GM papaya, for example, which was developed to resist the ring spot virus, a virus that nearly wiped out Hawaii's papaya industry, or potatoes engineered against late blight.
Okay, so resisting pests and diseases is one thing. What about dealing with weeds? I hear a lot about herbicide tolerance.
Right, that's another major category. Crops like Roundup-ready soybeans, for example, are designed to tolerate specific herbicides, mainly glyphosate.
Which means farmers can spray the herbicide to kill weeds without harming the actual crop.
Exactly. It simplifies weed management considerably for many farmers, and an interesting side benefit, actually, is that it enables more no-till farming.
No-till, why is that good?
Well, no-till farming means farmers don't plow the soil as much. This helps preserve the soil structure, reduces erosion, keeps more carbon in the soil. It's generally seen as better for long-term soil health.
Okay, so benefits for the farmer, potentially for soil health. What about benefits directly for, well, us, the people eating the food, like nutrition?
Absolutely. That's another really exciting area. The most famous example here is probably golden rice.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that. Vitamin A, right?
Exactly. It's genetically engineered to produce beta-carotene, which our bodies convert to vitamin A. And this is huge because vitamin A deficiency is a massive public health problem, especially in some parts of Asia and Africa.
How big a problem?
Well, the World Health Organization estimates, tragically, that somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 children go blind every year because of it, and many more die.
That's devastating.
It is. And golden rice, in regions where this deficiency is common, could potentially supply up to, say, 60% of a child's daily vitamin A needs from a normal serving.
That really does sound like a potential game changer for global health.
It has that potential, definitely.
What about other challenges? Climate change is making weather more extreme. Are GMOs helping crops cope with things like drought?
That's a very active area of research and development. And yes, we are seeing progress. For example, drought-tolerant GM maize or corn is already being used,
Where's that making a difference?
particularly in regions facing unpredictable rainfall like parts of sub-Saharan Africa. It offers farmers, a bit more stability and resilience when water is scarce.
Makes sense. And one more benefit often mentioned is shelf life. Reducing food waste seems like a good goal, too.
It really is. Food waste is a gigantic global problem. Some GM research focuses on slowing down ripening or reducing bruising in fruits and vegetables.
Like tomatoes that don't go soft so quickly.
Exactly. Or apples that don't brown as fast. If food lasts longer, from the farm, through transport, to the store, and even in your fridge, less of it gets thrown away.
Okay, so listening to all that, better yields, less pesticide use perhaps, better nutrition, climate resilience, less waste, it can sound like, well, a slam dunk.
It can paint a very positive picture, yes.
But we know it's not that simple. There's a whole other side of this story, isn't there? Significant concerns, real pushback. What's the case against GM foods? What are the worries?
You're right. It's definitely not simple. And what's interesting, I think, is how these concerns often touch on wider issues: environmental, economic, social.
So where do we start on the downside? Maybe the environment.
That's a big one. One concern is gene flow, the idea that genes from the modified crop could spread to wild relatives through cross-pollination.
And that would be bad because,
Well, the worry is it could potentially change the characteristics of wild plants, maybe give them an unintended advantage or disrupt natural ecosystems in some way. It's complex.
okay. What else on the environmental side?
There's the issue of superweeds. If you constantly use the same herbicide on herbicide-tolerant crops, eventually some weeds might naturally evolve resistance to that herbicide.
Making them harder to control.
Exactly. It potentially puts you back where you started, or needing different, maybe stronger herbicides. And then there's the broader concern about biodiversity. Relying heavily on just a few genetically uniform GM crop varieties, monocultures could make the food system more vulnerable and reduce overall genetic diversity in agriculture.
Right. Monocultures are a worry even without GMOs, I suppose.
True, but GM traits can sometimes encourage larger-scale monoculture farming.
Okay, environmental risks.
Mhm.
What about the one that probably gets the most attention? Health risks. People worry about safety, allergies.
Absolutely. This is probably the area with the most public debate and, frankly, anxiety. Concerns have been raised about potential long-term effects, whether GM foods could trigger allergies or if they might be toxic in some way.
So what does the science say? Is there a consensus?
This is really crucial. The overwhelming scientific consensus from major international and national bodies, we're talking the World Health Organization, WHO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, the US FDA, the EPA, the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA.
Pretty much all the major players.
Right. They've all reviewed the evidence extensively, and their conclusion is consistent. The GM foods that are currently approved for sale are safe to eat. They find they are no more risky than their conventional non-GM counterparts.
So the approved ones are considered safe based on current evidence.
Yes, assuming they've gone through the proper testing and regulatory processes, which are quite rigorous in most places that allow them.
That currently approved caveat seems important, though. Okay, moving beyond direct health or environment. What about the economics and ethics? That seems to be a big sticking point,
A
too.
very big one. A major issue revolves around ownership and control. Most GM seeds are developed and patented by large multinational corporations. Think companies like Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, or Syngenta.
And the patents mean farmers can't just save seeds from their harvest like they might have traditionally.
Generally, no. The patent agreements often require farmers to buy fresh seeds each year. This increases their reliance on these companies.
I can see how that would be controversial.
Definitely. It raises concerns about corporate control over the food supply, the loss of traditional farming practices like seed saving, and whether smallholder farmers, especially in developing countries, can actually afford the technology, the seeds, plus any associated chemicals or licensing fees.
It shifts the power dynamic quite a bit.
It really does. It brings up fundamental questions about who benefits and who might be left behind.
And all these concerns combined, health worries, environmental questions, corporate control, they fuel consumer resistance, right? We see non-GMO labels everywhere.
Absolutely. There's significant consumer demand for non-GMO options, driven by all sorts of reasons: safety perceptions, environmental ethics, sometimes religious reasons, or just a desire for food perceived as more natural.
And this isn't just individual shoppers. Governments have responded too.
Very much so. It's reflected in policy. Over 60 countries worldwide have implemented mandatory labeling for GM foods so consumers know what they're buying. Some places, like the entire European Union, Russia, India, have very strict regulations, and some even have outright bans on the cultivation or import of certain GMOs.
So a real global patchwork of acceptance and regulation.
Exactly. It shows just how varied public opinion and government approaches are on this.
Okay, let's zoom out now. We've talked pros, we've talked cons, but what's the bigger picture?
Mm.
How widespread are GM crops globally? This is where it gets really interesting, looking at the scale.
It really is. And connecting it all, the adoption rate itself tells a powerful story about their impact. GM crops are now grown in over 70 countries.
70. Wow. Who are the biggest growers?
The United States is actually the leader by far, planting over 70 million hectares of GM crops.
And what of the main crops being modified? Is it everything or just a few key ones?
It's concentrated in a few major commodity crops. Globally, the most common by area is definitely soybean. Something like 78% of the total global GM area is soybeans.
Almost 80%.
Huge.
Yeah. Followed by maize, corn, then cotton and canola or rapeseed. Those are the big four.
And in the U.S. specifically, what are the adoption rates like for those big crops?
They're incredibly high. If you look at data from, say, 2023, it was something like 92% of all corn planted was GM, 94% of soybeans, and 95% of cotton.
So almost all of those major U.S. crops are genetically modified varieties.
Pretty much the vast majority, yes. It's become standard practice in U.S. commodity agriculture.
We talked about yield increases earlier. Has this widespread adoption translated into major economic benefits overall? There's data suggesting it has. One group, PG Economics, estimated that between 1996 and 2020, GM crops generated around $261 billion in additional global farm income.
$261 billion, that's a massive number.
It is. It reflects those factors like higher yields and sometimes lower production costs for farmers, adding up over decades and across millions of farms.
And yet, despite that scale, that economic impact, and those high adoption rates in key countries, we still circle back to that point about the scientific consensus on safety. It seems important to reiterate that.
I think it is because it often gets lost in the debate. Again, major bodies like the WHO, FAO, FDA, EFSA, they consistently review the evidence and conclude that the approved GM foods pose no greater risk to human health than conventional foods.
So, the scientific consensus among these major regulatory and health bodies is pretty clear on safety for approved products.
Yes, based on decades of research and consumption, that is the current scientific consensus. This underpins why they are approved and grown so widely in many places, even while public debate and different labeling rules exist elsewhere.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. What does this mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate this? It feels like a real tension.
It absolutely is.
On one side, you have these, well, undeniable potential benefits, right? Higher yields, possibly less pesticide use in some cases, the potential for enhanced nutrition like golden rice, addressing major health issues, maybe more resilience for farming in a changing climate, tackling food security.
Real, tangible, potential solutions to big problems.
But then, on the other side, you have these equally valid concerns. The potential long-term ecological impacts, the risks tied to monocultures, the economic dependence on large corporations, and this deep, persistent consumer mistrust that leads to demands for labels or even bans.
It's a classic case of balancing potential benefits against perceived or actual risks and societal concerns.
So this really raises a crucial question for all of us, doesn't it? It reminds you that just having information isn't enough. It's about understanding it, weighing it.
Exactly, applying that knowledge critically.
And maybe the provocative thought to leave everyone mulling over is this. How do we, as societies, strike that balance? How do we weigh the incredible potential of this technology, its power, to maybe help feed a growing planet or fight malnutrition against these really diverse and deeply felt public concerns about the environment, about who controls our food, about preserving traditional ways?
It's a very complex recipe, isn't it? There are no easy answers.